Hey guys, we're gonna do a quick demo today on using nCloth, and I'll set up two examples that should kind of mimic what I showed you in class the other day. To get started, we'll go ahead and make something like a table, and so that'll just be a cylinder. And then to drape over top of it, it's going to be our tablecloth, which will just be a primitive plane. And so I've just used the two create primitive buttons up here, and the plane I'll scale up so that it can cover the tabletop. And then I'll also add in some extra divisions so that as the nCloth simulation is working, it has enough geometry to deform the tablecloth well. So to do that, I'm going to click the polyplane input 1 and to see the options. And so here you can type a few more divisions in. So I'll type 40 and 40. And so you can see that now I have a whole bunch more squares here, a whole bunch more edges, I should say. So more vertices to work with. From here, all you have to do is just start to attach some of the nCloth, I guess, solvers to get to them. But you have to switch your menu over to FX. And then once you're there, you can see that nCloth is one of the available options. So the first thing I'm going to attach is the nCloth simulation. And so I'll click my plane, click the nCloth, and then say Create nCloth. And then I need something for the nCloth to interact with. So I'll click the table or the cylinder and say that this is going to create a passive collider. So now, when the simulation runs, this table or this cloth will fall down and interact with this plane. And to get the simulation running, all you have to do is hit play on the animation. You should see a yellow line along the entire timeline to indicate that there's going to be a simulation that will happen. And it looks like it's working. It's definitely the default setting, so it's all slippery and it's falling all over the place, but it's working at least. So I'll just reset it, and then hitting this button will set me back to frame 1, or you can just drag the timeline or drag the slider back to frame 1 on the timeline. If you want more time on your timeline for the simulation to run, you can edit the number of frames that are available to you just by editing these numbers. The second number is the total number of frames in the scene, and the first number is the current visible frames, and that's what is represented by this slider. So you can, even though there's 200 frames, right now I'm only seeing 89 of them. But if you just want to add extra frames all at once, you can type a larger number in the first one, and it will automatically make that the new second number. So if I type 300 here, it'll give me 300 frames, and I can currently see 300 frames on my timeline. Cool. So moving on from here, let's do a little bit of customization of this cloth so that it's not so slippery. By clicking on your attribute editor, you can see that I have an nCloth a node attached to my plane here. And the two main categories that you would use to customize stuff is your collision tab or your dynamic properties tab. And you can spend a whole bunch of time in here just figuring things out. Or you can click on the presets and then pick between some of the presets that Maya has. I've used t-shirt a lot to pretty good success to mimic kind of general fabric. But if you want to go in and edit things, more power to you. But I'll just replace what's on here with t-shirt. And then I'll also come into my passive collider and just dial up the friction a little bit so that it's a little stickier. The other thing that I showed you guys is how you can see what is going on with your simulation by turning off and on in your collisions tab on your nCloth shape. This solver display has a couple things that it can show you. So if you show the collision thickness, you can see right now that the simulation is acting like my fabric is this thick. So I could dial that up or down. And in fact, it actually kind of looks a little bit wide to me, so I will dial it down so it's pretty thin. And then the self-collision, you can check to see that there's enough space between the different vertices that the simulation will behave as expected. But I'll turn both of those off so that I can run this again. And it looks like it's draping pretty nicely now. And after looks about 100 frames, I'll hit escape, and that can stop the timeline from playing. Alternatively, if it's playing, you can just hit the stop button and it will stop there too. So if you want to or if you want to use this as kind of your tablecloth or your cloth piece for your environment, you can just duplicate it by hitting Control D. And this doesn't have any simulation attached to it. So if you rewind that, then it's not affected by that at all. All right, so that is kind of the first straightforward way to kind of drape cloth over top of a collider. Okay, so the next thing that we'll run through is how to generate fabric and have it be influenced by kind of animating other things into it so that you can create unique shapes. To get started, I'll just delete my, my old simulation here. Delete that and delete that. Okay, and also make sure to delete that thing. So now all I have is my tablecloth that is saved out from my old simulation. To get started, I'm going to make a curtain. So I'll hit the primitive plane again, rotate it 90 degrees, scale it up a little bit so that get it nice and big, and then add some divisions once again. So I'll do another 40 and 40. That seemed to be pretty good. And accidentally switched it to wireframe. Once I have this, I want to create a piece of geometry above it that can animate, and then this thing will end up following it. So for that, I'll make a tube, or kind of more like I guess a rail, like a curtain would hang on. Then I will put it in position above, and then scale it to an appropriate size. So first I'll scale it out, and then I'll scale it in. And so something I mentioned in class the other day is you can, using the scale tool, if you hold Control and you click on one of the handles, it will operate on the other two handles instead. So you could do that with that, you could do it that way, you could do it this way. But basically this is a way where you can scale just kind of the radius of this pipe all at once instead of having to scale it this way and then scale it this way. Right, so anyway, holding Control, I'm clicking on the green handle, scaling it down. And then I need to add in some more edge loops along the way so that the vertices along the top have points along this that it can follow. So I know that I put 40 divisions in the plane, so I can just add 40 divisions to this thing by typing into the subdivision height and hitting enter. You can see that I now have 40 divisions along the way. So the next step is that I will put an nCloth simulation on this plane. So to do that, once again, I click the plane, click nCloth, and then say create nCloth. The next step is to attach the vertices at the top to this object up here. So I switched over to vertex mode, I highlighted all the top verts. I'm going to select this piece of geometry by hitting Shift Select, and then under End Constraint, I say Point to Surface. And you can see that some little dots have appeared. But when you run the simulation, you should see that they're connected. There's these little dots. And it's flapping around, it wants to fall, but it can't because it's attached to this thing. This is the default parameter, so it's pretty rubbery. Once again, I will go to the attribute editor to customize this and just switch it over to t-shirt once again so that it will behave a little bit more like cloth. So when I hit play, you can see it's not quite as springy, it's just a little bit springy, which is good. Excellent. So I'll hit escape to stop, rewind to the start, and now I'll animate this piece of geometry, which will then influence our nCloth. So to add some keyframes, which we'll need to animate, you select your piece of geometry and then you hit S. And then you'll see that there's a little keyframe here on the timeline. And so what this keyframe, you can see that over here in the properties that there are these red indicators that show you that there's a keyframe for each one of these channels now. So if I advance the timeline to maybe frame 100, and then I scale in like this, you can see that it's no longer solid red, so that means that I haven't locked in the keyframes yet. But if I hit S, then they're going to shift over to red, and that means I've locked in this new scale value that I've put for the cylinder. So if I go back to the beginning, and then I hit play, you can see as it's scaling in now, that the cloth is following it, and it's kind of bunching up, hopefully pretty naturally. Maybe it's a little bit, maybe the self-colliders are just a little bit too big. So I'm going to come in and downsize those. Yeah, so see how big these are? They don't really have much room to go anywhere. So the self-collide scale, I'm going to actually shift down to maybe 1.5. Oh, not 6. 1.5. That way they have a little bit of room to kind of move in on each other. So turn that off, and I'll rerun the simulation and see if the cloth is a little bit better to, yeah, so it's kind of coming together a little bit better now. Maybe I'll even dial it down to 1. It'll deform a little better. Cool. Yeah, it seems like this is getting pretty close to something I could use as a curtain. The final thing that I can show you is basically that even though I've set this whole thing up, I can keep customizing it by adding in even more colliders. So I'll make a new cylinder, rotate it on its side, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically have this thing push in and kind of bunch the fabric as though it's being pulled by like a draw, or a curtain draw, I guess. I don't know what they're called. But the same thing where I hit S, or I select the piece of geometry, I hit S, so I get a keyframe here, and then it's done, this thing's done animating at frame 100, so I'll hit S again, and then at this point I know I can slide this thing over into the curtain and hit S again. So if I start my simulation from the beginning, the curtain will scale in slowly, 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 and then once it's done doing that, this thing's going to move in place. Oh, but actually it's not going to do anything because I haven't added a collider. So that'll be the final step. So I'll hit escape, go back to the beginning, select my cylinder, go to passive collider. Now everything should animate and deform correctly. Waiting, waiting, waiting. All right, so now the cylinder moves into place, pushes the drapes over to the side, let the drapes settle a little bit more, hit escape. Looks pretty good. All right, so then duplicate it just like the tablecloth, and you can see that maybe if you don't like how the top group of faces are working, just because it's kind of hard for them to know where to go, you can delete a ring or a edge loop by selecting one face and then double click, holding shift and double clicking the face next to it. And when you do that, it will highlight the entire line, and then you can just hit delete. And because these are now separated, you can just double click the rest of the faces and delete those. Now, if you wanted to kind of stretch things out, you can still work with this piece of geometry just like any other piece that we've done so far. So if you've highlighted a group of vertexes at the top, you can hit B to turn on soft select, and then kind of make your region smaller or larger by dragging back and forth. So if you hold down B and you drag back and forth, you can adjust your radius for what will be affected. And then you can move these up a little bit, move these over, move this in. I'll shrink that down a little bit. Move that in. So you can end up customizing it even further if you haven't quite gotten what you want with your simulation. Okay, well, great. If you guys have any other questions, just bring them to class or send me an email, and I'll try and answer it as quick as I can.